In this video, what I'm going to be covering is the general steps that I would suggest going through when you're going through the planning and drafting process of EE. And most of this will be centered around doing a maths EE, so bear that in mind while I'm going through all of this. So, first things first, I reiterated this a lot in the previous video, but what's very important is doing a lot of reading and a lot of research. So first things first, what I would very much suggest is going through the EE guide. Now, I've provided the link over here that contains the EE guide, the updated version, and you should go through all the formatting guidelines, all the stuff they're looking for, and the marking criteria and being familiar with all that. Now, I'm also going to do my own run through in later videos, but I still think it's very important you do your own reading and just be familiar with that. Now, what I think is also important is to do some wide reading. And that is to take a look, read some books, read some articles, read some websites, all that kind of thing, and just try to garner new ideas. And I would suggest taking a lot of notes for those ideas. So anything that is sort of interesting, write some notes on it and sort of see if maybe this could be a potential avenue, a potential thing to look into for your EE. Then what I want you to do is to try to maybe write a bit of a short list. So once you've sort of figured out a bunch of ideas, try to narrow it down to maybe a top 10 or something like that. Just a top 10 list of different topics that you could cover. And then what I would suggest is for each idea, write some pros and cons. One might be a really interesting idea, but you can't really think of an approach for an essay, or it might be too complicated, or it might be too simple, anything like that. Write pros and cons for each individual idea or topic that you have looked at that you might consider in your shortlist. And then sort of try to gradually narrow down that list to something more and more specific as you start getting a better idea of what you think will work and what won't work. Then once you've sort of narrowed down your scope or what you sort of think could work, you need to then figure out a topic. This is basically after you've had your shortlist, you've had a bunch of topics, try to narrow it down to just one single topic. Now once you've gotten that topic, you also need to do a lot of more research. You'll still need to look a lot more detailed into that research and sort of figure out within that topic what specifically could you do? What could you bring to the table? What more research do you need to do? All of those kind of things. So within one topic, there could be still 10 ideas that could come from that, 10 different approaches, all those kind of things. So you sort of want to just consider all of that. Now, what is also important is that your idea cannot be the same as your maths IA. Ideally, you want it very, very different to your maths IA. If you do a very similar thing, you might get in a bit of trouble for that. So there is a guideline, do not make sure your idea is not the same for your maths IA as it is with your EE. So your topics can be from any field, as I've said previously. Alternatively, what it could also be is you could even do a statistical analysis of other experimental work, and that's called a meta-analysis, when you sort of look at other works and sort of analyze it all. You could even do the history of mathematics. Now, if you wanted to do any of those weird topics, as I sort of outlined, you need to make sure that it still has a consistent mathematical focus. So if I did a history of maths, I wouldn't be talking about the mathematician's personal history and their life and their kids or whatever. No, you'd still have a focus on the actual maths itself. So that'd be how, certain equations have been developed, all those kind of things. So no matter what topic you do, you need to have a consistent mathematical focus. It cannot just be descriptive. Now, what you also need to do is you need to extend on the maths in the IB syllabus, or apply it practically. Now, that is what I was saying before in my previous video about how I suggest you only do this if you have done Maths HL. Whereas if you've done Maths HL, you have a lot more tools to work with to create practical applications, or to even go beyond your syllabus and apply the stuff you know into harder situations, or even do a bit more reading and find some more challenging mathematics to apply for your extended essay. So please keep all that in mind. Now, what you should also do is once you've sort of narrowed down your ideas within that topic, I want you to try to formulate a preliminary research question. Now, what's very important is in your research question, your extended essay, it must be phrased as a question. So you'd maybe say how, or to what extent, or can we, or anything like that. As long as it is focused, it is phrased as a question. Now, what is also important is that your research question needs to be clear, focused, and arguable. So clear means that it is very obvious what you are going to be looking at. And in a similar way, focused means that there's a very clear direction in what way you are going. So, if I just said exploring matrices, that is not clear and that is not focused, because matrices is a big, big topic. How could I What specifically am I covering in that? Am I applying it to physics, anything like that? Even if I said matrices in physics, not clear, not focused, because there's a million different ways that could go. If I wanted to say, I don't know, measuring the projectile motion of a basketball using differential equations or something like that, I just made that up. I don't know if that'll work or not. That would be considered a bit more focused because it is clear about what I'm going to be using and what method I'm going to be employing. So that's important in your research question. You want to also include like the method that you are going to be employing. So, if I want to say modeling the spread of disease using, I don't know, some kind of special modeling, you need to mention what the method is, like very briefly in your research question. What technique, what mathematical idea are you going to be exploring? Now, arguable is also important because that is where you basically need to try to answer the question. So if I just did something like exploring matrices, we'll go back to that. That is not arguable because how do I measure whether or not I have explored it enough? If I wanted to measure the accuracy of like a model, I can easily compare that with like the real life version of it or something like that. So that is why arguable is very important because we need to sort of evaluate how well we have achieved that research question. So, modeling the spread of a disease using this model, that would be considered an arguable thing because we can see whether or not it was properly modeled or not. So that's what it means by arguable. Now, when you're considering like your research questions, you should be considering your outcomes and how feasible it is to answer. So, if I wanted to say, using mathematics to try to cure cancer, very unlikely you're going to be able to do that in your EE with your own research. So you need to think about how feasible, how possible it is for you, a high school student, to achieve your aim within 4,000 words, ideally less than 4,000. So if you feel like it is possible to do that, that is fine. Now your research outcomes you also need to consider what is currently known. If the current research is far too limited and there's not enough knowledge about this topic, I do not think it'd be a worthwhile one to cover because you will not be able to garner enough of foundational understanding. So you need to consider an area that has a decent amount of research so that when you do your own research, you will get a lot of information to apply to your essay. Now, what's also important is that when you do your research question, this will be like the backbone. This will be the whole thing that your essay will be building on. Your whole essay will be trying to answer that research question, essentially. So it should be encapsulating everything you want. That being said, it's fine if your research question is not perfect, and if it's not great, or it's very unfocused, or anything like that, that is completely fine in the early planning stages. Because it is very likely that when you do your actual essay writing or your planning, you realize your research question needs to be tweaked up a bit, changed. You might even change it entirely. The whole dynamic, anything like that, that is completely fine. I highly suggest that when you do your research, you consider and reconsider how applicable your research question is, whether you need to change your research or the question itself. And sort of just go through a lot of continual thought about this. Think about when you're doing your research, is this actually applying to the question or no? Is there an issue with the question or is there an issue with like where I'm looking for all my information? Now, again, once you've gotten your research question, you need to create a plan for how you're going to do all your research. So we need to think about, first of all, where we're going to get our information from. So we can get primary data. So that's like research you conduct or visualize yourself. So, if I wanted to go out and I did my own statistical analysis, I go and collected my own data, that's primary research. Or even stuff like if I decided to graph something myself, that is completely primary data because I did that all myself. Secondary data is scholarly articles, books, essays, anything like that. Those are all secondary data, and you should be using a bit of both where appropriate. So like if it's not appropriate to be using primary data, don't try to shoehorn it in there. But try to work both aspects wherever it is appropriate. I think it is important to have both somewhere in your essay, both types. Now, then we need to think about where do we get our secondary data from? I think it's a good place to start off is just normal Google, just sort of look at the normal websites. But when you're actually going to be referencing stuff in your actual essay, you need to be using more sophisticated sources. So another place I would suggest looking is that once you've gotten like a decent knowledge in your head, look into Google Scholar. So if you put in Google Scholar and then search using that, you will get much more sophisticated articles. You get stuff from scholarly articles, books, essays, all those kind of things. It'll give you a lot more sophisticated stuff to work with, and that'll be much better to reference in your essay. And it'll probably give you a lot better insights when you're actually writing your essay. Now, you can potentially also reach out to experts, see if they can give you any more insights on a matter, and then you can reference them directly and say you got this information from this professor from a uni or anything like that. You can also look into other databases, maybe JSTOR. So consider all of those kind of things. There should be other databases. Just look into that, see if your school gives you any special access, any of that kind of thing. Now, what's also interesting is you could also use university textbooks. There are websites out there that can give you access to textbooks. Anything that sort of gives you a wider perspective than the current syllabus that you are studying right now. Then what you should also do is you should also outline a plan for your actual essay itself. So this is like planning for the research, but now we also need to think about planning your essay. So you need to write out your aims, and I'd suggest writing a step-by-step plan on how you intend on achieving that aim and answering that research question. Because remember, that research question is the backbone of it. So if you feel like it is appropriate with the information you have and you can answer it adequately, write a step-by-step plan about what you plan on doing and think about how each step should be linking back to that research question and helping you answer it. Then what I would also say is it's important to create a timeline for the research and writing process, because it could be very easy to just leave the whole thing to the last minute. And then you've got a fat 4,000 word essay that you've got to write. So try to make your own mini deadlines. Say after a month, I want to have this much words done. After this month, I want to have 2,500 words done, all that kind of thing. Try to create your own deadlines and outcomes, especially if your school doesn't enforce any, then you need to do some yourself. And I would say the earlier you get everything done, the better, because when you're in year 12, or some schools have different year groups, but when you're in your second year of IB, the deadlines just sort of stack up. There's so much stuff that all becomes due back to back, especially for IAs and all that. So it is good to try to knock as much out of the way as possible. So try to create a timeline that you think is realistic, factoring in other deadlines, such that you can sort of get things done methodically, step by step, well before the actual essay is due. Now, I know I've put a lot of emphasis on research because it is just so important, because there are so many marks dedicated in this essay just for research, because at the end of the day, this is a research paper, even if you are doing your own stuff in mathematics. So write lots of notes and make sure to take a note of where you get all that information from, because remember, referencing is important. So if I have a note document, I should be making sure I at least include the link at the top so I can know where the notes are coming from. So if I get it from one website, I get all my notes, write all the notes from that, but then I'll have a subheading which is the link. And then if I get information from another website, I make another subheading with that website link and then have notes underneath that. That way, when I need to ultimately do my referencing at the end, I can easily click on the link, and then generate my references from there. Now, also you need to make sure that everything that you do reference should be of high quality. So once again, not Wikipedia, but also in your EE, they're a bit stricter about this. Try not to get stuff from like normal .com websites. Make sure they're educational websites or they're academic sources, all those kind of things. So this is similar to what I was saying before. Start with reading just the standard sites, stuff that you probably wouldn't be referencing, but then I want you to progress to scholarly work, which you will actually reference. Now I say start with the standard stuff because it'll be easier to understand. Then once you feel like you've got that fundamental understanding, you can go to the more sophisticated sources and reference that information because you'll understand it better and be able to apply it more practically. So most scholarly information I would probably say would be published in journals, and that's going to be used through databases such as JSTOR or Google Scholar. So please factor that in. Now I also want you to structure your notes to reflect the structure of your EE. So once you feel like you've gotten like a whole heap of information and you've sort of figured out how all this can contribute to your research question, I want you to reshuffle the notes with the corresponding references for each note. Also, that's important. But sort of restructure it so that the order of the notes follows the steps that you want to have in your actual EE. So, have an introduction subheading and then have all your notes for the introduction there. Have a subheading for step 1, or that, etc., all the way down to your conclusion and discussion. So I think that's very important, sort of trying to organize your notes so that it's just not just a heap of information all over the page. So once you've organized it, when you actually translate it into writing, it is a lot easier to understand the thought process you had initially when you were researching and planning for your essay. So once again, if your research question turns out to be too hard or too easy or too simple or anything like that, please change it. Nothing wrong with changing your research question. It's probably a good thing because you get to reflect on it later on in your reflections. So if you want to change your research question, go ahead. No dramas with that whatsoever. So what's also important is that you may find that because you're probably looking at more sophisticated stuff, information New information you might contradict old stuff that you found before, or things that you thought you understood. And that is completely fine. That is all about just reflecting on that and just sort of trying to work with the new information you get and just trying to sort of figure out what is going on. It may be a bit tricky, but it's just something to keep in mind. It is completely fine. If you encounter contradictory information, you just got to sort of figure out what sources seem the most reliable and what is the best things to work with and what makes the most sense logically. Now, you should use this research to develop a better idea of what is and is not possible in the scope of your own writings, because you need to think about, once again, you are a high school student and you're writing 4,000 words. You are not a PhD student, you're not an honors student at university, you are just a high school student, so there's only so much you can achieve. Now, there's still plenty you can. Don't think that that's like an excuse to slack off. No, you can still achieve so much as a high school student, but you still need to be realistic with what you set out to be possible with your essay. So using all this research, you should be better able to figure out, hang on, my research question is way too unreasonable, I need to change it a bit to be more focused or specific. So all those kind of things, that's what your research is there to sort of help you sort of figure out. Now, this is back to that idea, you will likely have to reevaluate things, and that is completely fine. As long as you just think about what is realistic for you and what would be realistic for your teacher to understand, the person that marks it, whoever that may be. If you feel like with your research you've got a better understanding and you can change things up a bit, that's completely fine. Now, once again, then after you've gotten all your research, try to plan an E structure. So once you've gotten like everything, you need to create a more comprehensive plan. And of course, as I was saying before, that plan may completely change. Your approach may change, your research question may change, even just maybe the steps might change or the methods. That's all completely fine. As you go and do more research, you probably will have to change things. Now, your structure should be logical and all of it should work to answer that research question. So that is fairly important. So everything you do should be contributing to that research question in some way, shape, or form. Now, the E is relatively open in terms of how you want to approach this structure. I'll go through a suggested structure in a later video, but it's just something important to keep in mind. Now, what I think is important is to write subheadings to make it clear what each section will be about, and even including stuff like subheadings, all that kind of thing, I think is fairly important. And then, as I was saying similarly before in the research section, organize all that research underneath each subheading and subheading to sort of make it work. Now, when you're doing your writing, I want you to work to implement all the ideas in accordance to your plans. So once you've sort of structured all your notes and you've sort of figured out how you want to approach everything, that's when you sort of translate that all into writing. Now, you should also make sure you be using correct mathematical formatting and fonts. That's LaTeX or word equation mode or any other thing that sort of presents formal math formatting. Now, what's also important is that when you're doing the writing, you might encounter some issues, or you're working out, your calculations might not make sense, or any of that. That is completely fine. You may just need to reevaluate a few things, change things up. So you can see in a lot of the whole process, things might not go according to plan, and that is completely fine. It's just, this is why I was sort of saying it's important to have early deadlines for yourself. That way, if things go wrong, you have plenty of time to change it up and fix it accordingly. And also you may need to reconsider a few things about fitting the word count and all those kind of things, or re-explaining certain concepts that may actually be fairly difficult or abstract for a person without this background in that field is needed to understand what is going on. So when you're actually writing, you need to communicate a few things. You need to communicate your way of thinking. So this is like your process, your thought process. So like, if you introduce a formula, you need to explain how that formula exists. Why is it there? What is it doing? How does it make sense? All those kind of things. You need to justify the way of thinking, and then you also need to explain why is that in the first place? What are you going to use it for? Why are you using it? All you'll be working out, similar to how you'd approach a maths exam, you need to show your way of thinking. You need to explain everything and all that kind of thing. You also need to define all your definitions and conjectures, all those kind of things. You need to explain everything. You need to make it very clear to your marker what you are doing and why. You also need to make sure you include the correct symbols, theorems, graphs, and diagrams. All those kind of things, very, very important. Similar to the Maths IA, your graphs and diagrams should all have subheadings, little like figure 1, or for diagrams, figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, all that. Even tables should be calling it table 1, table 2, table 3, etc. All those kind of things are fairly important, and you should be using the correct mathematical notation. So you should be using times as an actual times, not as the asterisk or anything like that. So correct mathematical formatting like you would write it in an exam. And also you need to have and communicate correct justifications for your conclusions. So because of all your mathematical working, if you've laid it out all logically, you should be able to then explain what conclusions are from that working. So if you can justify it correctly, that is what they are after. So I'm going to reiterate this one more time. You need to provide explanations for everything you are doing, because the teacher that is reading that essay needs to understand each step and what direction you're going. Why are you doing this? How is this going to achieve that research question? That is all very, very important in the writing process. And then after that, you need to read through your essay after you finish writing it up and reread it and reread it and reread it. Change things up, check everything makes sense, check all your equations are correct, try to fact check everything. That is all very, very important. And also consider if there are things that are unnecessary or things that aren't adequately explained, or you don't have enough, or you're not expanding enough. So you need to think about if there's too much or too little of anything in your essay. Very, very important to consider. So I need you to also work on focusing on clarity. That is very, very important. Make sure everything is very clear and concise. Now, you may also feel like you need to change things, and that is completely fine. Once again, if you have early deadlines, there's absolutely nothing wrong with having to do things a bit early. And yep, that's it. So that was sort of my advice on like sort of what you should do in the build-up and the writing of your essay. And my next video, I'll be covering the actual structure that I would suggest you go through for your EE. So I'll see you all in the next video.